Viewers and listeners, welcome to yet another episode of The Conversation. My name is Anotida Chukumbu. I'm your host, and today I'm excited to have Amanda Hammar. Amanda Hammar is an associate professor at the Center for African Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Today we are set to discuss her book, Displacement, Economies in Africa, Paradoxes of Crisis and Creativity. This book was published in 2014 by Z Books. Professor Amanda, welcome to The Conversation.
Thank you very much, Anotida. I'm delighted to be here. It's really nice that you invited me.
Wonderful. I'm the happiest man. How is your day going so far?
It's going beautifully. I've had the miraculous opportunity to travel from Copenhagen to Lisbon for 3 months. In spite of COVID, I managed to come through, and I'm spending a sabbatical period here trying to focus on a number of pieces of work. So I'm feeling well in Lisbon.
Wonderful, wonderful. I love that. So before we get to talk about the book, I understand that you are the president of the European African Studies Association, and as well, you are the project leader of the certifications of citizenship in Africa. Can you just briefly describe the work that you do with these two organizations or these two projects?
Sure. Really, I can. Happy to do so. And they're obviously very different things. The one which is actually, we call it for short the European African Studies Association. It has the name AEGIS, A-E-G-I-S, which has a long, complicated name. So I won't go into it, but it's the European African Studies Association called AEGIS. So I became the president of it a year ago. It's for a 4-year period. I was previously on the board for 3 or 4 years as a board member. So what I would love to tell your listeners about AEGIS is that it's a large association which covers the whole of Europe. And it's not individual membership, it's by member institutions. So unlike the ASA in the United States or the ASA in the UK, our membership is not individual, it's institutions, which means it has a lot of continuity and substantial institutional form. So we have over 30 members, both mainly full members and some associate members. And these have to be institutions that have full research full research focus on Africa. They don't have to be called African Studies, but they must be focused on Africa research-wise. To some extent, some are also teaching, but not all. It's not policy think tanks, it's academic, it's the research sphere specifically. And our main, every 2 years, not like the ASA and USA, but every 2 years we have a big conference, the ECAS conference, which is actually the biggest gathering of Africanist scholars in one place, bigger than the USA and UK. So we have the last time over 1,600 participants presenting. Very exciting environment with, scholars, European and African scholars in Europe, also African scholars from Africa who gather, present very good work, network, learn about each other's work. And the other thing about ECAS, it's had a very long history, but in recent years, it's developed what we call thematic collaborative research groups. So one's on Africa and the Indian Ocean, one's on conflict, African conflict, resource extraction, urban Africa is emerging, displacement and so on. And one can be an individual member of what are called these CRGs. You don't have to be part of an AEGIS member institution. So these are very open thematic research networks, which really are very exciting and have activities and so on. So that's about AEGIS and the European African Studies. And of course, it's really exciting to be somebody who's given this honor and responsibility, to try and hold things together, to pull together all these wonderful resources, support them, generate as much new ideas, new contacts, especially with African institutions and African scholars. So it's quite a job, it's quite a responsibility, but have a fantastic board, plenary members from all the institutions. And there's a lot of dynamism across Europe in research on Africa. It's really exciting. that's on the sort of the level of, you know, doing service in the name of African studies, which I strongly believe in. On an individual level, my own research you've just mentioned is a new project I've got funding for 4 years, just recently started, and it's called Certifications of Citizenship in Africa. It's Certizens for short. And with my own Center of African Studies, the Institute of African Studies in Ghana, and the Department of Development Studies in Makerere University in Uganda. So we have these 3 main partners, and the focus is comparative, or sort of not directly comparative, but using 2 case countries to look at regimes of national and individual certifications of citizens. So national registration systems, voter election system, electoral systems, passport systems, birth certificates, and so on. So on the one level, it's about how do national systems classify, register, certify, validate, and produce documents, ID documents for their citizens, clearly in uneven and differentiated ways. So we always see hierarchies of citizenship through looking at this. But we're interested in the national systems. We're interested in the bureaucracies that produce and generate ID documents and what all that entails. We're interested in the materialities of documents. So what happens when it changes from a paper to a metal card, to a plastic card, to a biometrics, with all those effects. And we're very interested in how individuals within certain groups experience and have a relationship to ID documents. So I'm also very thrilled about that project and working with my partners on that.
That's a wonderful job. You're doing a very good job.
Thank you.
That. So
you're a little bit soft. I don't know why I can't hear you so well, but I'll try and turn my volume up. Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
A little bit better.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I was saying you are doing a very good job, and I very much love it. I hope that our audience very much engage with all the ideas that you have been talking about. So now let us talk about displacement economies. What do you consider to be the core ideas of the book, and possibly tell us about what inspired these ideas and how did they come into being?
Thank you for asking me this. And although it's a book that was published in 2014, it's a very deep and important theme for me. So I'm really happy to get the chance to talk about it. I'll give you a very sort of summary idea of what the ideas are, and then because I'm going to have to expand on that in a little while, and then tell you something about how it came about. But they're very interrelated. Why I moved towards this approach I call displacement economies is a lot to do with a sort of experience of. Let me start with this. So particularly, I had long ago already worked on displacement themes. My doctoral research in Northwest Zimbabwe and the sort of agrarian margins had focused on eviction by the local government, rural local government, of small-scale migrant Zimbabwean farmers who'd gone from other parts of Zimbabwe, moved into the margins close to national parks, had settled there, had actually started to grow cotton quite productively, but for various kinds of reasons I won't go into, this rural local government evicted them violently. And I started my research around questions of eviction, why, who, what was the political economy of eviction, how did people deal with this, and so on. So I'd had this theme already in my mind for a long time. Then, of course, the Zimbabwe, I don't know if your viewers know this, but I am Zimbabwean.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful.
Yes.
Yeah.
And of course, from 2000, I finished my doctoral work, well, I was doing my doctoral research in the late 90s, but of course, from 2000, we know that the crisis in Zimbabwe, which had been building up, escalated, and there were mass sort of land occupations, some call them land invasions, depending on your political perspective, but there were mass urban, rural displacements. Hundreds of thousands of farm workers were displaced. white commercial farmers were displaced and so on. That was going on in the rural part of Zimbabwe. And at the same time, by mid-2000s, 2005, we know that there were mass urban displacements with Operation Rambachina. So, it was hard to, first of all, painful as Zimbabweans to know that all this violence was happening and people's lives were being disrupted, for different kinds of reasons. So it was hard to think about Zimbabwe and focus on it without this issue of displacement being there. And yet displacement wasn't being talked about as a phenomenon in itself, which was not new to Zimbabwe or any parts of Africa. You've had colonial displacements, long histories of displacement, but here was this incredible concentration of actions that were displacing, dislocating, forcibly resettling people. So this theme became even more prominent, but as I looked for ways to talk about the very complex, interrelated dimensions of specific displacements, I found it impossible to find approaches, concepts, literature that would help me put all these things into relationship with each other. So that's why I started to look for a way of thinking about displacement, a language, conceptual language for it that would help me see and unfold and explain and analyze what the multiple dimensions of displacement are, which are always historical. It's never just a one-off event. It's always spatial because, of course, displacement is about place and displacement. It's also always about time, and it's always enforced. So that's part of my sort of understanding is other parts of it is that it is also always involving far more actors than just the most visible displaced. There are those who displace them. There are those who manage the displaced as a category, either through humanitarian forms or state forms. There are people who are brokers within displacement processes, hosts, those left behind, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's about the multiplicity of displacement. So the book focuses on certain kinds of approaches to displacement. One of the most important parts of it is the relationality of displacement. It's not something singular. It's not a single event. It's multidimensional. So it's multidimensional, and we need to find ways to look at the interconnectedness of these different elements and different actors and different processes and different effects. Relationality is a very important part of it. The other important part is the paradoxes in displacement. As you see, the title of the book is Paradoxes of Displacement in Africa.
Exactly. Yeah.
And the paradoxes refer to the fact that, and again, you need to have a wider perspective on displacement to get that point, which is displacement as a phenomenon it's a space, it's events, it's practices, it's experiences, which have both, you could say there is both order and disorder at the same time. There is both, destruction, and certain things get produced at the same time. It's about immense uncertainty, but again, in a temporal sense, mundane, desolate sameness. It's about destruction, creation. So it's got constantly, if you look at its many dimensions, it has simultaneously, and this is not good, bad, but, wealth and impoverishment. I mean, the incredible part of looking at displacement in this way, and this is the third major thing, so it's relationality, it's paradoxes of displacement, and then this third major question that the book asks in different contexts is not only what generates displacement or displacements, but what does displacement itself produce? What does it generate? And I have I've sort of established, the introduction to the book sort of establishes a kind of a framework, which is an approach, not a theory of displacement. It's an approach to thinking about displacement. And it has a whole number of questions. I'm just going to sort of give myself the chance in my own notes to sort of be able to repeat them. But it asks, when one asks oneself, what does displacement produce? I'll try and explain what I mean by that. So on the one hand, you could say in the course of actual displacement events or continuum of displacement, what on the more economies side, material economies side, which is not all that this displacement economies refers to, but you could say, what are the changes in the value, commodification, forms of exchange that take place in the face of displacement? So you have value changing on certain kinds of things, certain kinds of objects, whether it's land as an object or a property, whether it's commodities that, as we know, in the major part of the crisis in Zimbabwe, the value of the Zimbabwe dollar that was, the value of the actual dollar changed, so that people were buying and selling wads of money that had a different value from the official value. So money changes value. The value of physical bodies changes. For example, people doing labor under normal conditions in Zimbabwe, who lost jobs or the value of their wages were lost. We know that people did either cross-border trading, but some people also were selling their bodies. So just in that sense, the value of things, of bodies, of persons, and the forms of exchange, and that was changing in Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe is just an example because I know it so well. Then other kinds of, what else does displacement produce? One asks, of course, forms of production, forms of accumulation, forms of distribution of wealth radically change under conditions of displacement, whether at very sort of small localized levels or at the scale of an entire country. We know about war economies, for example, shadow economies. Under conditions of conflict and crisis and displacement, people lose access to property, others gain access to property, and so on. So that's really on that other level. And still on the economies more generally, we know that both formal and informal economies get altered under conditions of crisis and displacement. Again, in Zimbabwe, we had a rather formal economy, both in the sort of agrarian production, but also manufacturing and commerce and so on. And if you look at Harare, Bulawayo, the cities of Zimbabwe today, it's like hyper informalized. So again, what is it that displacement produces more than just physically displaced human beings, which is profound, but it's also changing forms of value, exchange, production, distribution, and so on. But beyond more of these like formal economies, there's also notions of time, experiences of time change in displacement, conditions of displacement. People's sense of, the future, what the past means, what the present means changes when you're stuck or when you're dislocated from the routines and the rhythms and the expectations of life. The notion of the future radically alters for some people, for all people perhaps. And then maybe the last one I'd mention for now is, how do social identities change, social relations change, gender relations change? Again, taking from, and I'm just using Zimbabwe because, as I say, it's so familiar to me, but in this huge crisis with so many layers of displacement over the last 20 or so years, we know that there's been a sort of shift in, for example, who can actually generate livelihoods. It used to be maybe more formally a male adult breadwinner, the older male in the family. Now it's shifted to women playing a much greater role in income generation through informality. So age-wise, younger men who can kukiakia, as Jeremy Jones, who's in, you know, the sort of ability to maneuver, to go in between things, becomes a more valued and more productive form of income generation than the formal jobs that people have held or maybe still hold but don't get a living salary for. So gender and age and class shifts, these are all things that displacement in the wider sense does alter.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Professor Amanda. And thank you very much for the reference to Professor Jeremy Jones. I recently interviewed him on this show, and
Yes.
it was quite a profound experience. So now I understand that this was an edited collection with probably a number of contributors.
Yes.
How did the original ideas evolve further through the making of this book?
Good question. Because in fact, as I say, I had my own sort of impulses and compulsions to explore these questions, but it was never something either that I wanted to do on my own or that I believed was viable or valuable to do on my own. So right from the start, when I began thinking about how to expand understandings of displacement, it began firstly, I mean, I'm sort of backdating a little bit. So the first collective process began when I had been employed by the Nordic Africa Institute in Uppsala, which is a research institute on Africa. And I was employed in as a research program coordinator, and I could define my own program. And I called that program Political Economies of Displacement in Southern Africa.
Nice.
Yes, and I was already starting to have these ideas, and but what I did was start to look for and contact people whose work resonated. They were not necessarily calling their work in that way, but I could recognize that by reading people's work and identifying interesting scholars who I would have conversations with, you know, and we'd dialogue about these ideas, and we found that there were some things we could talk through together and explore. Collective work was a special issue of the Journal of Contemporary African Studies, published in 2008, which I think was, you know, the special issue was called something like Political Economies of Displacement in Southern Africa. And it was Southern African focused. I co-edited it with a wonderful colleague who at the time was at the Refugee Studies Centre in Oxford, called Graham Rogers. And we gathered together scholars in two panels at, I think it was a African Studies Association UK conference, 2007. We brought together some scholars and worked with them through this primary idea of what do political economies of displacement help you think about in your work. So we had, I don't know how many, 5, 6 in the special issue with a covering conceptual chapter with Graham Rogers. That was in 2008. In 2010, well, in 2008 physically, I initiated through my program and co-organized with others in Johannesburg a large conference around this theme. It was a fantastic and moving conference. It was at the height of like the hyper crisis in Zimbabwe, hyperinflation that Jeremy's probably also talked to you about. And this fantastic gathering of Zimbabwean scholars and Zimbabweanist scholars and some others talking about the effects on the region. So this big gathering in Johannesburg, from that, myself and 2 colleagues, Joanne McGregor, who's on the board of the Journal of Southern African Studies, Lauren Landau, who was for a long time the director of the Advanced Migration Studies Center in Wits University, we co-edited a collection of 10, 11, 12 fantastic articles, which was published as a special issue in 2010 in the Journal of Southern African Studies. I really recommend that you read, you know, dip into that. And Jeremy Jones's article on Kukiakia, on young men in Chutungwiza outside Harare, you know, brokering, managing, moving from here to there, has been extremely well received by many. So that was 2010. So these were collective processes for me.
Mhm.
But I also realized, and this is a sort of a personal intellectual journey, you could say, that I am Zimbabwean, and I started with all my core intellectual political questions being generated from Zimbabwe, because it matters so much to me.
Mhm.
But as I moved to do my PhD in Denmark and then moved to the Nordic Africa Institute, and the Nordic Africa Institute being an African studies environment, I was sort of compelled to, even while things were so intensely important and intense in Zimbabwe with the crisis, and I wanted to and did stay engaged with it and still am, I also began to understand the limits of only thinking from one place in the world, or from one place as in one perspective.
Mhm.
All one's questions coming from the same place, and everything you look at, you're trying to answer the same questions. So what was very healthy and important and refreshing was at the Nordic Africa Institute being forced to think about the continent, the African continent, not just my part of the continent. So maybe I started with some of my questions from coming from and out of Zimbabwe and applying them to elsewhere, you know, mentally.
Mhm.
And at the same time, hearing from meeting so many African and Africanist scholars and having to, you know, learning a lot about the rest of the continent, and then realizing there are different questions that people are faced with and asking themselves. And maybe it's a good idea for me to turn back to Zimbabwe and Southern Africa and say, you know, why aren't we asking ourselves some of those questions as well?
Mhm.
At the same time, I can bring my Zimbabwe inflected questions to other parts of the continent, ask them in new places, learn new things by asking the same question in new contexts. So going back to, you know, the publications, the special issues of journals that were about Southern Africa and Zimbabwe,
Mhm.
when it came to this edited book, I was interested in asking similar questions about political economies, or then what became to be called displacement economies, not just about Zimbabwe or Southern Africa, but what did it mean to ask these kinds of questions in different parts of the continent?
Mhm.
So the volume, the Displacement Economies volume, which again, as I say, is a very collective enterprise overall, it has, besides the conceptual introduction, it has 10 other chapters in it. 3 of them are Zimbabwe related. One is another one by Jeremy Jones. One is by Sarah Bracking, who's a political economist who's talking about sort of the flow of money outside of Zimbabwe as a result of displacement.
Wonderful. I was talking to Sarah Bracking like a week ago.
You were?
Hopefully I will have you on one of these shows.
Very good.
Wonderful.
So Sarah Bracking's piece is also a Zimbabwean related piece in that book. But then there are other contributions. One, I'm just sort of reminding myself of what they are. So one is, for example, by a younger scholar, Hannah Elliott, about the Somali community in Nairobi. We know about, there's a very large displaced Somali community in Nairobi, and about what happened to the camel milk economy, because it used to be very focused in Somalia and Somaliland, and now with this large community of Somalians emerged this very vibrant camel milk economy. So she writes that and also how women are involved in that. So that's a case in Kenya and in Nairobi. There's somebody who writes about, Christine Udelsman Rodriguez, who writes about the diamond economy in Angola as a result of the war and displacement and so on. So there's another case. Martin Evans writes about Casamance, Senegal, years and years of displacement and resettlement across this kind of border area. Tim Raymakers writes about the DRC, youth in the DRC, also close to a border town, but how they are dealing with this kind of dislocated lives and physical dislocation. We've got somebody who's talking about the Somaliland diaspora and how that has affected relationships and economies in Somaliland itself. Let's see what else. There's a case on northern Uganda and this incredible squeezing of northern Ugandans during the war in the northern Uganda, and what that sort of meant to communities there. I don't know if I've left anything out. I'm just looking at, but you get it. And one is on the Darfur-Chad border. So first of all, you can see that the spread is right across different parts of the continent, different kinds of displacement contexts, some violent wars, some internal political issues, some at very localized levels, some at larger scales, bigger economies, local economies, social dynamics, and so on. So that has opened up a wider sense of, these questions, and deepening and reinforcing, actually, I would say, my original ideas. I'm lucky for that. I was challenged. Some people think that the idea of displacement economies is far too broad. I think it needs to be fairly open. And I would like to say why I think that it's important, if I may.
Oh, yeah, sure. We have all the time.
Okay. So, because when I also started off trying to find literatures and concepts and approaches, of course, there is an enormous body of work on refugees, displaced persons, IDPs, very sound and robust and interesting and deep literatures. But it's in what I would sort of very simplistically would say here, it's within the refugee studies arena. And it's also, and understandably, very largely defined by what I call operational questions, and humanitarian questions, obviously, and technocratic questions. So a lot of the literature in refugee studies is about this category, the refugee or the IDP or, the refugee camp or et cetera, all of which is hugely important, but it wasn't a language or a framework that helped to look at all these dimensions which aren't within that framework, that humanitarian framework. Because as I say, there's a lot of paradoxes about displacement, also including within, refugee camps themselves, question, who is benefiting, who's managing them, what are the political economies, what are the differentiations between refugees, and there are many differentiations. Okay, so the refugee studies body of literature did not work for me. And I do make a distinction between what we're doing with this displacement economies, political economies approach, and that. So again, I couldn't find what I wanted in that literature. The other literature, and again, hugely diverse and rich and amazing, is the migration studies literature. So migration studies, of course, many people do also include what's called forced migration, but not always. And there's this blurring where migration is often understood to be about mobility, movement, and choice in some way or another. I'm not saying that, of course, in a context of displacement, people, refugees, fleeing, etc., are also making immediate choices. But it's, for me, what is really important about displacement thinking and displacement economies is about understanding the enforced nature in a material sense, in a spatial sense, in a historical sense, and in a very personal sense and symbolically. And this enforced part is not really dealt with in a comprehensive way in migration studies. It kind of blurs too much. So again, part of like why I thought it was important to, and I'm still doing a bit of mobilizing and promotion, as you can hear, there is a place for, of course, looking at the lateral relationships between displacement studies, if you want to call it, migration studies and refugee studies. But there is also something about these multiple dimensions of displacement that need attention on their own or in themselves, let's say. So I've been quite driven by making that distinction, not as an academic territoriality, but very profoundly because of the blind spots that other approaches have, because they're not thinking about these particular questions. But blind spots, so what does it mean when if you categorize people, say, in an operational or technocratic way, and you cannot see, say, the links, the spidery webs in which people are enmeshed in better and worse ways, actually. And you only work on the level of certain kinds of operational categories. You don't look at you don't historicize an event. It becomes an event and an emergency. And even if many of these are now chronic and protracted and so on. So, what happens when you don't understand these relationships, when you don't look closely enough at differentiation within, say, so-called displaced populations? Also, what about those who enable displacement, those who generate it, who perpetuate it, those who benefit from it? And I mean in a negative way, but also positively, when you don't recognize that new economies emerge and maybe these could get supported or recognized. So I think there's a political reason why it's important to look much more broadly, not just, as I said, it's not academic intellectual territoriality. I was different from that. It's because fundamentally I saw all these dimensions, and I was looking with others for a language to be able to make these things visible, understandable, analyzable, translatable, say, for policymakers. So I'm still on this mission.
Wonderful, wonderful. You are on a very good mission, if I may say.
Wow, it's sweet. Thank you.
So, what major contribution does this book make to the thinking about displacement, and why does it matter so much?
Well, in a way, I think I've said why I think it matters so much, because millions and millions of people are affected by displacement in obvious and less obvious ways. Of course, there are the figures of how many millions of people are dramatically displaced. We see it every day. We're seeing it now in Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, and so on. So there's conflicts and wars producing displacements. There's also so much internal state-generated displacements in many, many places. I guess I have, for my own reasons, been more focused on state-generated violence, because I think there's a very close relationship between displacement and state-making, actually state-building. But so one part of it is to make visible a much wider range of experiences and phenomena of displacement.
Yeah.
Just the obvious ones that we all see and are pained by. And then again, in those which are, emergency situations and so on, still, I think we need to make visible many more of the histories, the dimensions, the multitude of actors who are not always visible, but have effects all the time on these conditions, to become more conscious of those and attuned to what are the implications. And then I would say, when you say what contribution in a more academic and intellectual sense, first of all, I've had some very positive feedback, especially on that book, and people are teaching with it. I've spoken in different contexts. I've also taught with these ideas myself at the Center of African Studies and elsewhere. And teaching is not something just by the way. Teaching is a political practice.
Nice.
Dare I say. And helping people to think more openly, to think more critically, to think more relationally. I see that as a sort of intellectual political project, because it always has effects. students, you know, young students, older students, whatever age you are, come into sort of these spaces of curiosity. And they also come with masses of assumptions and simplifications. That's in the nature of things. Until you know more, you do simplify. That was my history. I had to come out of doing development years in Zimbabwe to thinking about development. So I see the contribution also as being in giving people approaches, languages, questions to open things more and think more critically.
Wonderful, wonderful. Professor Amanda, thank you very much for this conversation. Thank you very much for this interview, for your insightful ideas about displacement and about the book. Thank you very much for joining me. This is the platform where I get to sit with established academics to discuss about their outstanding publications and their experiences with research and many other issues affecting the continent in particular. Thank you very much for this and have a good day.
Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you.